who really stands behind this injustice? It's not who you think. Behind the closed doors, there are powerful figures making decisions that shape the lives of millions. The truth? It's darker than you could ever imagine. You won't believe how deep this goes. Washington, D.C., 1992. The hearing room was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, but the kind that suffocates you thick, tense, and waiting. Rows of reporters sat with pens poised, eyes shifting between senators and witnesses. The air buzzed, not with sound, but with expectation. Then came the slow, uneven shuffle of old boots against polished floors. Every step echoed louder than the last. A man, his back hunched, face worn from both age and history, moved toward the stand. He wore a neatly pressed World War II uniform, though the colors had faded, just like the memories. America had tried to forget. His name was Samuel "Smokey" Davis, 81 years old, a veteran of a war that gave him medals, but no voice. Until now, he took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice, steady, grounded, almost defiant. My name is Private First Class Samuel Davis. The first served in the 92nd Infantry Division, Italy, 1943. A pause. The room leaned in. I'm not here for myself. I'm here to talk about a man, a soldier, a brother Thomas Reed. His voice cracked ever so slightly. He saved a man who hated him, gave his life for a country that barely let him wear the uniform. And when he died, they told his mother he wasn't qualified to be buried in Arlington because he was colored. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some lowered their eyes. Others clenched their jaws. But Smokey didn't flinch. 50 years, he whispered, his voice almost breaking. 50 damn years, and not a single word. No ceremony, no headstone, no thank you for your service. Just silence. A long pause. He looked down, then back up. His eyes found the senators some uncomfortable, others deeply moved. So today, I speak. For him, for all of them, the ones buried in unnamed graves, the ones who fought 2 wars, one against the Nazis, the other against their own flag. Silence fell again, heavier this time. And then, fade to black. A caption appears on the screen, Italy, 1943. Before the bullet, before the betrayal. This is the story of Thomas Reed, the sound of marching boots, distant artillery, and a single trumpet note cuts through, haunting and raw. Cut to a young black soldier stepping off a military truck in the dusty streets of Salerno. His uniform is too big, his boots are worn, but his eyes burn with quiet fire. Thomas Reed has arrived, and so has the war that would test everything he believed about courage, brotherhood, and the country he called home. Salerno, Italy, September 1943. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a harsh orange glow over the beachhead. The smell of salt water mixed with the bitter scent of gunpowder, and the waves crashed like the sounds of distant cannons. It was a battlefield. But to Thomas Reed, it felt like something more, an alien world where hope was the only thing scarcer than food. He stepped off the truck, his boots sinking into the sand. He looked around, feeling the weight of history pressing against him. Not just the weight of the war, but the weight of something far deeper, something he had carried with him since the day he was born. The weight of being black in a world that wanted to see him as less than human. And now, here, in a foreign land, fighting a battle for a country that didn't even consider him an equal. He wasn't the only one. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, had come to the shores of Italy alongside the rest of the American forces. They had been relegated to the most dangerous, least desired posts, fighting on the fringes of the battlefield, far from the spotlight. The black soldiers were here to fight for a country that still saw them as second-class citizens, their bravery unseen by those who had the power to honor it. But they fought anyway, as soldiers do. Thomas adjusted his rifle and wiped the sweat from his brow. He had come to Italy hoping for a chance to prove himself, to be more than just a soldier in name. But the world around him made sure to remind him he was black first. Hey, Reed, you need a hand? It was Smokey, his closest friend in the division. Smokey was about the same age as Thomas, but his eyes always carried the weight of someone who had already seen too much. He was always making jokes, cracking smiles, but beneath the humor, there was a sorrow that ran deep. Thomas shook his head, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I've got this, Smokey. You should be resting." Smokey snorted. "Rest? When we got Nazis to kill?" But the truth was, rest was a luxury few soldiers could afford, especially the black soldiers who were fighting two battles, one against the enemy in front of them, and one against the system that saw them as expendable. Thomas knew this, even though he rarely spoke of it. It was easier to focus on what was in front of him, on the mission, on survival. The first few days in Italy were a blur of dirt, blood, and smoke. The soldiers advanced through rugged terrain, moving cautiously, waiting for the next attack. The Germans were entrenched on the high ground, and the Allies were pushing through the narrow streets and dense forests, making slow, deadly progress. Every corner, every door, every shadow held danger, and for Thomas, it wasn't just the enemy he had to worry about. "Reed, you stay here," the sergeant barked one morning as he moved the soldiers into position. "You're on rear guard. We'll take the front." Thomas nodded, without question. He had learned that lesson: early questioning orders could get a man killed, or worse. As he took his position, he scanned the area, every muscle tense, ready for anything. From his vantage point, Thomas could see the other soldiers moving up the hill, their backs straight, eyes forward. They were giving it their all. And yet, there was something about their movements that made his heart sink. They were moving as if they were on a different battlefield. The officers weren't just pushing them forward, they were sending them into the heart of enemy fire, knowing that they'd take the brunt of the attack. The black soldiers were often sent to do the dirty work, the things that the white soldiers didn't want to do. And the officers? They knew that many of them wouldn't make it back. As night fell, the soldiers gathered around a small fire, the only source of warmth in the cold, bitter air. They sat in silence, the crackling of the fire, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Smokey leaned back against a rock, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You ever wonder why we're here?" he asked, his voice low. Thomas didn't answer at first. He knew the question wasn't rhetorical. Smokey had asked it 100 times before. It wasn't just about the war, it was about everything. Why fight for a country that would never fight for you? Why sacrifice everything when the world didn't even see your worth? Finally, Thomas spoke. "It's not about the country, Smokey. It's about what we're fighting for each other." Smokey looked at him, his face unreadable. "I don't know about you, man. I'm fighting for me, for my family. I'm tired of fighting for a country that don't care." Thomas understood that feeling, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. There was something inside him, something deep that still believed in the idea of fighting for something bigger than himself. Even if that something was broken, even if it was flawed, there was a part of him that still thought it was worth fighting for. The next day, the war was closer than ever. The Germans had launched an attack, and the sound of artillery thundered through the valley. The black soldiers, once again, were called to the front. As they advanced, the thunder of gunfire filled the air, and the air grew thick with smoke. Thomas and Smokey moved forward, their rifles aimed at the German lines. The tension was unbearable. They had been told to stay low, to move carefully, but they knew they couldn't be slow. They had to move, or the enemy would catch them. "Get down!" Smokey yelled as a German soldier popped up from behind cover. A burst of gunfire erupted, and Smokey dove to the ground. The world around them seemed to slow, the sound of the bullets whizzing by louder than anything else. Thomas didn't hesitate. He fired back, taking down the soldier in one shot. But as he did, he caught a glimpse of something else, a German officer, standing just a few yards away, aiming his rifle directly at him. Before he could react, there was a loud thud, followed by the scream of a man. Smokey had fired, saving him. "Thanks," Thomas muttered, his heart racing. Smokey grinned, but his eyes were hard. "No need for thanks, Reed. Just doing my job. Just doing my job." They pushed forward side by side, but in that moment, something had changed. They were no longer just soldiers, they were brothers, bound by the same fight, the same struggle. And it didn't matter if they were black or white. In that moment, they were just soldiers, fighting for their lives. The days blurred into one another. The sun rose, the sun set, and the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division continued to push forward, fighting through mud and blood. Every day, The fighting grew fiercer, and the stakes higher. But for Thomas Reed, something else was happening, something that didn't show up in the casualty reports or the battle plans. He had always believed that courage would lead to respect, that merit would be seen for what it was. He'd been fighting for that belief, fighting for a place where he wouldn't have to constantly prove himself. But now, with every day that passed, the world around him was making sure he would never escape the weight of who he was. He wasn't just fighting Nazis. He was fighting a system that wasn't going to let him win, not completely. One afternoon, Thomas stood in front of a series of maps, marking positions with a piece of chalk. The front lines had shifted. The Germans were getting desperate, but this was what Thomas had trained for: leading, organizing, giving orders. His division had been through hell, and the men needed someone to direct them. As he stood there, one of the officers approached. It was Captain Jensen, the officer assigned to their company. He had always been polite, professional, even kind, but today his face was tight, as if weighed down by some unseen burden. "Reed," Jensen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been doing good work. We need you on the command post tomorrow. We're rotating the officers for a strategy session." Thomas looked at him, waiting for the catch. "You mean to lead it?" Thomas asked. Jensen hesitated, then nodded. "You're the best we've got, Reed." But Thomas waited for the but the brass upstairs. Jensen trailed off, his voice lowering. "They don't want a black man in charge of this operation. I'm sorry, but they're pulling you from the roster." Thomas stared at him, the weight of those words settling in like a stone sinking into his chest. He knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't being pulled because of lack of ability. He wasn't being pulled because the men didn't trust him. He was being pulled because of his skin color. Jensen saw the fury in Thomas's eyes, but he didn't know how to fix it. He was just following orders, just doing his part to keep the mission going. "Jensen, you can't be serious," Thomas said, his voice shaking with frustration. "I've earned this. I've fought for this. I've saved men's lives. And now you're telling me it doesn't matter?" The captain didn't answer. He just lowered his eyes, his face flushed with the shame of an unwilling messenger. He wanted to say something to make it right, but there was nothing to say. Thomas stepped back, fists clenched at his sides. His breath came in sharp, controlled bursts. This wasn't just a military decision. It was an indictment of everything he had ever believed about the country he was dying to protect. His loyalty, his sacrifices, his service, they didn't mean a damn thing. Not in a country that saw him as less than. "Get out," Thomas said, his voice cold. "Just get out." Jensen didn't need to be told twice. He turned and walked away, his head low, the sound of his boots slowly fading into the distance. For the rest of the day, Thomas was numb. The orders had been made, and there was nothing he could do about it. He wasn't even sure how he managed to keep moving, to keep fighting, but he did. He had learned long ago that to stop, to show weakness, was to invite destruction. Night fell, and once again the soldiers huddled around a fire. Smokey had his usual smile, his cigarette dangling from his lips as he passed around a tin of beans. But even he could see something had shifted in Thomas. There was a tension in the air that didn't belong. "What's eating you, Reed?" Smokey asked, his voice light, but the concern in his eyes unmistakable. Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared into the fire, the flames flickering and dancing in his eyes. He didn't know how to explain it, how to put into words the storm that was brewing inside him. He didn't know if it would ever go away. Maybe it wasn't just about losing command. Maybe it was about everything, the whole damn system that was rigged against him, his men, his brothers, his family. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight. "They took it away, Smokey. They stripped me of the one thing I had left." Smokey didn't ask what Thomas meant. He already knew. There was only one thing Thomas had wanted from this war: recognition, respect, not from the enemy, not from the public, but from those who stood beside him in the trenches. And now, even that was taken from him. "That ain't right," Smokey muttered. "You know you should be leading us." "Hell, we all know it." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Doesn't matter what we know, Smokey. It's not about what's right, it's about what they want." Smokey shook his head. "But you're better than them. Better than any of those." He broke off before he said too much, but his meaning was clear. "I don't know anymore," Thomas whispered. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Smokey's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in, lowering his voice. "Don't ever say that, Reed. Don't ever say that. You're stronger than all of them put together." But Thomas wasn't listening. His mind was far away, lost in the haze of betrayal and anger. The fire crackled as the wind picked up, but in his heart, there was only silence. The war had stopped being about survival. It had stopped being about protecting his country. Now, it was about something darker, something he couldn't control. It was about proving he was worth something, even when the world told him he wasn't. He stood up suddenly, his body rigid with resolve. "We're going to take the fight to them, Smokey, but this time, I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for us. For every damn black soldier who's ever been thrown aside." Smokey looked at him, his face serious for the first time in days. "You sure about that?" Thomas nodded. "I'm sure." And with that, he turned and walked into the night, ready to face the next battle, one that wasn't just against the Nazis, but against the very system that had failed him. The night after the conversation with Smokey, the weight of the decision settled heavily on Thomas Reed's shoulders. The air in Salerno was thick with the scent of sweat, smoke, and fear. In the darkness of the camp, the soldiers tried to sleep, but the constant barrage of distant artillery ensured that no one would rest easy. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. How could he, when everything he had fought for seemed to be slipping through his fingers? He had already been stripped of the one thing he truly wanted to lead, but now he had something else to prove. Not to the brass, not to the country, but to himself. He wasn't going to be a silent cog in their system. He was going to fight with every ounce of courage he had left. As dawn broke over the battlefield, a chilling silence fell over the camp. The orders had come through. The attack on the German forces entrenched in the hills of Salerno was set to begin. Captain Jensen had gathered the men, his voice low but urgent. "We're advancing up the hill. The Germans are dug in deep, but we have to push them back. This is our chance to make a real impact." Thomas, standing at the back of the formation, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be back at the rear, following orders. But he couldn't just sit by anymore, not after everything that had happened. As Jensen spoke, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of a looming storm. The sun had barely risen, yet the air seemed to hum with the promise of battle. The soldiers, most of them young, nervous, checked their rifles and gear, silently preparing for what they knew would be a brutal, bloody day. The command came to move, and the soldiers began their slow, tense march toward the front lines. Thomas followed in the back, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't stay behind. The men needed someone they trusted to lead them up that hill, and he knew he was the one they were looking for. The rumble of tanks and artillery fire echoed in the distance as the soldiers neared the hill. Thomas watched as Jensen gave orders to the platoon leaders, his face strained, his voice trembling with the knowledge of the danger ahead. But something was off. There was a hesitation in Jensen's eyes, a reluctance to put his men in harm's way. Thomas knew that hesitation. Well, it was the same one he had seen in the eyes of officers who didn't believe in their men, who didn't believe in their ability to win. And then it happened. "Reed, stay back!" Jensen's voice cut through the air, his command sharp and frantic. Thomas froze, his heart pounding. "I'm not staying back. I'm going." He took a step forward, but Jensen was quick to intercept him. "You're not leading this mission." The orders came from higher up. "They don't want you on the front line, Reed," Jensen said, his words clipped, almost apologetic. Thomas's fists clenched at his sides. He had been here before. He had heard these words before, but this time he wasn't going to back down. "You can't tell me where I belong. I'm going up that hill with my men. If you want to stop me, you'll have to do it yourself." Jensen opened his mouth, as if to argue, but the moment passed. Thomas turned and began walking toward the front lines. He could hear the rustle of Jensen's orders behind him, but nothing could stop him now. He had made up his mind. The battle for Salerno began with a deafening roar as artillery shells exploded in the distance. The soldiers scrambled to their positions, huddling behind whatever cover they could find. But the Germans weren't going to make it easy. They had prepared for this assault for weeks. The first wave of soldiers had barely made it to the base of the hill when the German machine guns opened fire. The air was alive with the crackling of bullets, the distant thud of artillery, and the screams of men in pain. Thomas ducked behind a rock, his rifle steady in his hands. The orders came from the rear: move forward, take the hill, push the Germans out. But there was no hesitation in Thomas's movement. He had already seen the fear in his men's eyes. He wasn't going to let them go forward with doubt hanging over them. "Smokey, we're going," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Smokey, ever the loyal friend, nodded without question. The two men moved forward together, rifle raised, moving from cover to cover, determined to make it up that hill. The Germans were dug in tight, and they weren't going to give up easily. But Thomas led his men with the precision of a veteran. He moved faster than anyone else, taking down German soldiers with cold efficiency. His movement so smooth, it was as if he had done this 1,000 times before. At one point, a German officer appeared at the top of the hill, firing down at the advancing soldiers. Thomas spotted him, his eyes narrowing with focus. Without thinking, he raised his rifle, aimed, and fired. The officer dropped, his weapon falling to the ground with a dull thud. But in that moment, everything seemed to slow. The sound of the gunfire faded away as Thomas's mind raced. He had made the shot, but now he had to make sure the rest of his men followed through. He couldn't lead them from the back. He had to show them that they were capable of winning. They needed a leader who would stand beside them, not behind them. As the soldiers reached the top of the hill, Thomas felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. They had done it. They had taken the hill. The Germans were retreating, their lines shattered by the unexpected ferocity of the black soldiers who had defied their commanders. But as the battle raged on, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The victory felt hollow, like a battle won with the wrong kind of price. He glanced back down the hill, and his eyes locked with Captain Jensen's. Jensen was standing near the base, looking up at the men who had fought so hard. But there was no smile, no look of pride, only silence. Thomas couldn't help but wonder, did it really matter? He had led the charge. He had shown them all that he was more than what they had made him out to be. But he wasn't sure if it would ever be enough. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle began to fade, Thomas stood at the top of the hill, his rifle at his side. His men gathered around him, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief. But Thomas's heart was heavy. He had defied orders. He had proven his worth. But in the end, was that all he would ever be? The soldier who had to fight, not just the enemy, but the very country he had sworn to defend. The battle for Salerno was over, but the cost of that victory was etched into the faces of every man who had fought. The once pristine uniforms were stained with dirt and blood, and the air, still thick with the remnants of smoke and gunpowder, carried an odd sense of quiet. The men, exhausted and broken, moved sluggishly through the aftermath, cleaning weapons, tending to the wounded, and trying to make sense of the carnage they had just survived. Thomas stood at the edge of the hill, watching as the last of the German soldiers retreated into the distance. The adrenaline had long since worn off, and now all that was left was the heavy weight of what they had accomplished and what they had lost. The hill was theirs, but at what cost? The sounds of battle slowly faded, replaced by the dull murmur of soldiers speaking in low voices, many of them still processing what had happened. Thomas didn't feel like celebrating. He hadn't even thought about what they had just achieved. All he could think about was what was missing. The bodies of the fallen were being carried away. Some of the men were already in the process of being buried, but Thomas noticed something odd. The bodies of the black soldiers were treated differently. The white soldiers were being gathered in a special section for proper burial, their names to be remembered. But the black soldiers? They were simply placed in unmarked graves, buried quickly and without ceremony, as if their lives hadn't mattered. A chill ran down Thomas's spine as he watched the men being laid to rest. He had fought for a country that didn't even care enough to honor the men who had died for it. His comrades, who had bled and died on that very hill, would be forgotten. Their stories would never be told. Read. It was Smokey, his voice urgent as he jogged up to Thomas. His face was covered in dirt, his expression tired, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Thomas's heart sink. "What's wrong, Smokey?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "Read, man, you need to come with me. You're not going to believe this." Smokey led him to the rear of the camp, where a small group of officers were standing in a tight circle. At the center of the group was Captain Jensen, his face grim as he spoke to a higher-ranking officer. Thomas felt his stomach twist. He knew this wasn't going to be good. As they approached, Jensen looked up, his expression softening slightly when he saw Thomas. "Reed," he said, his voice tight. "I need you to understand something." Thomas crossed his arms over his chest. "Understand what?" "The brass," Jensen continued, glancing nervously at the higher officer. "They've made a decision. They're not allowing you to be buried with the other men." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Jensen said, his voice faltering, "they're not giving you a proper funeral. They're not recognizing your service. You're being buried elsewhere." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Buried elsewhere? You mean I'm not even going to be allowed to rest with the men I fought beside?" Jensen nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Reed. I tried to fight for you, but they won't budge on this." The orders came from higher up. It was as if the earth had shifted beneath Thomas's feet. The weight of his sacrifice, the blood he had spilled, the men he had saved, it all came crashing down on him. None of it mattered. His country, his commanders, had just proven what he had always known deep down. To them, he was still less than, still expendable. "You've got to be kidding me," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I gave everything, and this is how they repay me." He wanted to scream. He wanted to rage against the injustice of it all. But what good would it do? He had fought for a country that didn't want him, and now, even in death, he would be denied the honor that every other soldier received. Smokey stepped closer, his voice quiet but full of fire. "We're not going to let them get away with this, Reed. You've earned more than this. You deserve more than this." Thomas looked at his friend, seeing the fire in his eyes. Smokey was angry, too. They both were. But anger alone wouldn't change what had happened. The system had already made its decision. "Smokey, it's not about me anymore," Thomas said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us. Every black soldier who has ever fought and died without recognition. Every one of us who's been thrown away without a second thought." "Then what do we do?" Smokey asked, his tone more desperate now. "We fight," Thomas said quietly. "We fight with everything we have. We keep going. We show them that we're more than they'll ever see us as." It wasn't much, but it was something. And in that moment, Thomas knew that this battle, this fight for recognition, for dignity, for justice wasn't over. It would never be over. Later that evening, as the soldiers gathered around the campfire, word of the injustice spread. But there was no official word, no formal acknowledgement, just whispers, promises, and the quiet understanding that something had to change. No ceremony, no funeral, no honor. But as the night stretched on, one by one, the black soldiers gathered together. They stood in a circle, their heads bowed, their eyes burning with the same quiet rage that had fueled their fight. And though there would be no public funeral, no national recognition, they gave Thomas Reed the one thing that no one could ever take away: their respect. They would never forget him. Not now, not ever. And in that moment, Thomas realized that sometimes the greatest honor doesn't come from the country you fight for. It comes from the brothers who fight beside you, from the men who know what it means to sacrifice for a cause that may never love you back. The year was 1992, nearly half a century after the battles of Salerno, and the men who had fought side by side in the 92nd Infantry Division were scattered across the country, some living quietly, some with memories that had long been buried under the weight of time and pain. But for one of them, the past would no longer remain silent. Smokey had spent years trying to move on, trying to bury the anger and frustration, the injustice he had felt when Thomas Reed was denied the honor he deserved. But now, at the age of 81, Smokey found himself back in Washington, D.C., standing before a panel of government officials who could just maybe right the wrongs of the past. It was a rainy afternoon when Smokey walked into the hearing room, his cane tapping rhythmically on the marble floors as he made his way to the seat reserved for him. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him, years of struggle, years of silence, years of waiting for someone, anyone, to finally acknowledge what had been stolen from them. The room was filled with faces that seemed unfamiliar, even though some of them might have been the same faces that had turned a blind eye to the stories Smokey and his brothers had carried for so long. The chairs were filled with dignitaries, reporters, and a handful of men in military uniforms, their ranks barely visible in the dimly lit room. Smokey took his seat, adjusting the stiff fabric of his suit and straightening his back. He had fought for his country once, for his brothers, and now this was the fight that would define his legacy, his last battle. The committee members began to take their seats, shuffling papers, adjusting microphones, and checking the time. Smokey's eyes remained fixed on the panel, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His mind drifted back to those days in Italy, to the bloodshed, the fear, and the betrayal that he and Thomas had faced. But he couldn't afford to dwell on those memories, not now, not when the world was finally going to hear the truth. The room quieted as the hearing began. The chairwoman, Senator Elizabeth Hayes, a woman with silver hair and a commanding presence, leaned into the microphone. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "today we gather to hear the stories of those who served in the segregated divisions of the U.S. military during World War II. The men of the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, fought bravely, but their contributions were largely forgotten. It is time for that to change." Smokey's heart began to race. He had heard these words before, but hearing them now, after all these years, was different. This wasn't just some empty promise. This was the chance to finally get the truth out, to tell the world what had really happened, to honor his fallen brothers. Hayes continued, "We have with us today Samuel Davis, a veteran of the 92nd, who will share his testimony. Mr. Davis, please proceed." Smokey stood up slowly, feeling the eyes of the room on him. His body ached with age, but his spirit had never been stronger. He gripped his cane tightly, took a deep breath, and walked toward the microphone. His heart was heavy with the weight of the words he was about to speak. The room fell silent. Smokey cleared his throat and began, "I'm here today because my friend, my brother, Thomas Reed, is no longer here to speak for himself." Smokey paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He died on the battlefield at Salerno, giving his life for a country that wouldn't even allow him to be buried with honor. He died fighting for a country that didn't see him as a man but as a second-class citizen. And when the battle was over, when the dust settled, he was forgotten." A murmur rippled through the room, but Smokey kept going. "I'm not here for me. I'm here for Thomas. I'm here for every man who fought in that war, who sacrificed everything, only to be buried in unmarked graves, to be erased from the history books, to be dismissed as if our lives didn't matter." He paused again, letting his words sink in. "I've carried this anger, this sadness, for far too long. We all have. The men of the 92nd deserve more than this. We deserve to be recognized, to be remembered for the heroes we are, not just for the color of our skin, but for the courage we showed on those battlefields." There was a long silence. The panel members exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of shock and shame. Smokey could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let them off that easily. "I'm asking you today, right here, to give Thomas Reed the honor he deserves, to give all of us the honor we deserve, to correct the history that was wrongfully written. It's never too late for justice." Senator Hayes leaned forward, her gaze softening as she looked at Smokey. "Mr. Davis, your words are powerful, and they're long overdue, but you're asking for something that's far more than just recognition. You're asking for accountability." Smokey nodded, his grip tightening on his cane. "Yes, ma'am, I am. We fought 2 wars, one against the enemy on the battlefield, and the other against a country that didn't care. But we're here now, and it's time for them to see us, to honor us, to give us the recognition we've earned." There was a brief pause as the committee deliberated. Then, the chairwoman spoke again. "We hear you, Mr. Davis, and we will make sure your voice is heard. We will begin the process of awarding Thomas Reed and his fellow soldiers the recognition they've been denied for so long. The families of those who have passed will be contacted, and we will ensure that proper ceremonies are held." A wave of relief washed over Smokey. It wasn't the victory he had expected, not yet, but it was a start. It was a small crack in the wall that had been built to silence their stories, to erase their sacrifices. But it was a crack, and cracks could widen. The committee's decision wasn't final yet, but it was the beginning of something bigger. Smokey felt a lump form in his throat as he thought of Thomas, of how he would never know that his fight, their fight, was being heard. How many men like him had died without anyone ever knowing their names? But now, at least some of them would be remembered. As the hearing concluded, Smokey stepped away from the microphone, his legs weak but his heart steady. He had done what he set out to do. He had given voice to the silent soldiers who had fought for justice, not just on the battlefield, but for the recognition they deserved. And though the fight was far from over, Smokey knew one thing for sure: Thomas Reed had not died in vain. The years passed slowly in the quiet town of Washington, D.C., but for Smokey Davis, the battle was far from over. It had been months since the hearing, since the small victory that had sparked a sense of recognition for Thomas Reed and the men of the 92nd Infantry Division. But the story, while beginning to find a place in the history books, had not yet found its proper closure. The soldiers who had fought and died in the hills of Italy, in the trenches of France, and in the deep jungles of the Pacific still had so much left to say. And so did their families, their children, their grandchildren, the generations who had lived without understanding what their ancestors had sacrificed. Smokey stood outside a small cemetery on the outskirts of Washington, staring at the gravestones that lined the hallowed ground. The wind was cold, and the sky above was heavy with the promise of rain. It was a stark contrast to the warmth he felt inside, as if the clouds above were too ashamed to allow the sun to shine down on the moment. In front of him, a simple stone marked the resting place of Thomas Reed. There were no grand monuments here, no marble columns or flags flapping in the wind, just a small, unassuming grave that had been tended to by the few who still remembered. The name Reed was carved into the stone, a quiet tribute to the man who had given everything for a country that refused to recognize his sacrifice. It had been years since Smokey had stood by Thomas's side. He had promised him then that one day the world would know what kind of man Thomas had been. And now, though it had taken decades, that promise was slowly becoming a reality. The fight for justice wasn't over, but the world had begun to listen. For Thomas, for all of them. Smokey took a step forward, his cane tapping against the ground as he approached the gravestone. The wind seemed to settle around him, the world growing still as he stood there in silence. "Thomas," Smokey murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "I never forgot. None of us ever did. You kept fighting, even when the world turned its back on you. You fought for your country, for your family, for your brothers. And now it's time we did the same for you." He paused for a long moment, his eyes lingering on the weathered stone. A breeze stirred the leaves around him, and Smokey felt as though Thomas was still standing, there beside him, that quiet strength still alive in the air. The fight for recognition, for justice, wasn't just about the medals or the parades or the public acknowledgments. It was about something deeper, something more essential than any ceremony or accolade could provide. It was about the recognition of a life well lived, of a sacrifice that could no longer be ignored. And even now, when the world had finally begun to open its eyes, it felt too late to truly give Thomas what he deserved. But Smokey had learned over the years that justice was never easy. It was never given on a silver platter. It was something you fought for, even when it seemed impossible. And that's exactly what he had done, what they had all done. The sound of footsteps approached, soft but steady, interrupting Smokey's thoughts. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He could feel the weight of the years in the air, the quiet understanding shared between the few remaining members of their division. "Smokey," came the voice of James Carr, a former soldier in the 92nd, his face marked by the years but still carrying the same fire. Smokey had known all those decades ago. "You came, didn't you? I knew you would." Smokey smiled faintly and nodded. "Wouldn't be right if I didn't." James stood beside him, his hand resting on the gravestone as he stared down at the name of his old comrade. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a man can give everything and yet still be forgotten by the country he died for. Smokey said nothing at first. The silence between them felt sacred, as if the two of them were sharing something far more important than words could convey. But finally he spoke. "We never stopped fighting, James. We couldn't. For men like Thomas, for all of us, we fought for a country that wouldn't even acknowledge our names. And now, when they finally start to hear us, it feels too little, too late." James nodded slowly, his face lined with both grief and understanding. "But better late than never, right?" Smokey smiled, though the expression was bittersweet. "Better late than never," he echoed. They stood there together, two men who had carried the weight of injustice for decades, sharing a quiet moment that no one else could understand. It wasn't a victory, it wasn't even closure. But it was something, and for Smokey, that was enough. After a long pause, James spoke again. "You know, when I heard they were going to give us the recognition, I thought it was a dream. A part of me thought maybe it was too much, too late. But when I saw the faces of the young men in the audience, when I saw the way they looked at us, I knew it wasn't about the past. It was about the future. We fought, and now our children can know the truth." Smokey looked up at the sky, his eyes narrowing as the clouds began to break apart, letting a few rays of sunlight shine through. The rain that had threatened to fall now seemed to hold back, as if nature itself had decided to give them this moment. "Maybe this fight is over," Smokey said quietly, "but the next one will be for them, for the generations who won't have to fight the same battles we did." James looked at him, a fire sparking in his eyes. "For them. We fight for them." Together they turned away from the grave, walking slowly back toward the cemetery gates. Their steps were measured, but there was a sense of peace in their stride. The world had changed just a little bit, and the stories of men like Thomas Reed would never be forgotten again. But as they walked, a voice echoed in Smokey's mind, the voice of Thomas, still standing with them, still guiding them forward. "Fight for what's right, brother. Fight for the future. Never stop." Smokey didn't need to look back. He knew that Thomas's spirit would always be with him, a part of the legacy they had fought so hard to build. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The next chapter was theirs to write. If you believe justice should never be ignored, drop a number 1 in the comments below. Let's spark a conversation on the real cost of turning a blind eye to injustice. Your voice matters, and it starts now. And remember, the most valuable lesson here: we cannot afford to stay silent. Standing up, speaking out, and demanding change is how we break the chains of systemic injustice. It's up to us to hold the system accountable. Don't let the truth slip through the cracks. Share it, fight for it, and be a part of the change.